The following information is in reference to the Binghamton City School District's Teacher Annual Professional Performance Review, or APPR plan, and the other measures component, specifically the Nysut Rubric. Earlier this year, staff worked on creating goals around student growth and achievement. These two components, also known as Student Learning Objectives, or SLOs, make up 40% or 40 points of the overall APPR score. The Nysut rubric is a component of the other measures, or 60%, 60 points of the overall APPR score. Other measures include observations and documentation of a teacher's performance. Two separate rubrics will be used to measure the teacher's performance: the Pearson rubric and the Nysut rubric. The Pearson rubric contains 10 standards. These same 10 standards are the areas that administrators are looking for when completing announced and unannounced observations. At the end of the year, each teacher will receive a score of a 4, 3, 2, or 1 for each standard. An average of the standards will then be calculated. Also throughout the year, staff should collect evidence or artifacts. The Nysut rubric that is used as part of the district's APPR plan will be held up against the artifacts. Our plan includes 5 standards. Standard 1, knowledge of students and student learning. Standard 2, knowledge of content and instructional planning. Standard 5, assessment for student learning. Standard 6, professional responsibilities and collaboration. And Standard 7, professional growth. Each of these standards contain a variety of elements. While teachers may elect to submit evidence or artifact against any of the elements, they are only required to submit evidence against one element in each of these 5 standards. For Standard 1, it's element 1.3. For Standard 2, it's element 2.4. For Standard 5, it's element 5.1. For Standard 6, it's element 6.5. And for Standard 7, it's element 7.2. Now let's take a look at the Nysut rubric so we can better understand the differences between the overall standard and the required elements. For the Nysut rubric, the overall standard 1 requires the teachers to demonstrate their knowledge of each student and how each student's development and learning are promoted to provide achievement for all. If we look specifically at element 1.3, what is going to be required is for teachers to provide evidence that they have demonstrated knowledge and are responsive to diverse learning needs and strengths, interests, and experiences of all students. It is recommended to best understand what each rubric or element is measuring is to look at a score of a 3. In this case, a score of a 3 would measure the degree to which the teacher varies or modifies instruction to meet the diverse learning needs of most students, and how the teacher plans instruction to address the strengths, interests, and experience of most students. Accompanying this video are examples of some possible artifacts. It is extremely important that the staff read the rubric before submitting evidence. Evidence is supposed to be representative of a teacher's ongoing practice and not be completely inclusive or created just for the purposes of submission. The quality of the evidence should be present, rather than quantity. Here you will see a list of some potential examples of evidence that could be held up against 1.3. These are examples. It is not expected for staff to submit examples of all of these. Rather, look at your evidence of your ongoing practice, and then read 1.3. In other words, how does your instruction address the diverse learning needs of students? Some possible artifacts include reflection on lesson plans that demonstrate the lesson was modified either during the lesson or for later teaching, a completed KLQ chart that demonstrates questions student had on the content that could be used to drive instruction, lesson plans that are designed to incorporate cooperative learning structures with guidelines or instructions on how they were used, or perhaps lesson plans that incorporated multiple intelligence with guidelines on how the multiple intelligence were used. Again, lists of sample artifacts have been provided for you. The staff may elect to submit evidence against other elements in the Nysut standard. What will happen is the scores for each of these elements will be averaged, resulting in a single score for the standard. Each of the pieces of evidence or artifacts may be submitted for review to the principal through My Learning Plan, or a teacher may submit the artifacts directly to the principal in some other format, being certain that you identify the standard and the element that each piece of evidence represents. For a submission deadline, please consult the question and answer document that accompanies this video. Now we're going to walk through a scoring example based on evidence that a teacher may have submitted. In this example, you will see that I've highlighted the element in each standard that is required. Let's say that a teacher submits an artifact for element 1.3 and receives a score of a 3. They then also submit an artifact for element 1.1 and receives a score of 2. Prior to receiving the score of a 2, notice that the average for standard 1 was a 3. Now adding the 2 to a second piece of evidence results in an average for that domain of 2.5. Continuing on down with the model, for standard 2, let's assume that they submitted evidence for 2.4 and received a 3, for element 5.1 and received a 2, for element 6.5 and received a 3, and for element 7.2 and received a 4. An average is then taken across all 5 standards, resulting in an average score for the Nysut rubric of 2.42. The Nysut rubric represents 20% of the other measures. So the average score of 2.42 is then multiplied by 0.2, resulting in a weighted average of 0.48. The Pearson rubric, which is again a rubric used against the observation of a teacher's practice. In this example, let's assume that the average across all 10 domains or standards is a 3. This number is then multiplied by 0.8, representing 80% of the overall other measures. The weighted average then would result in a number 2.4. To obtain the total point value then for the other measures, you would add the 2 weighted averages, resulting in the number 2.88. So again, the Pearson rubric represents 80% of the other measures, so the average score was multiplied by 0.8. The Nysut rubric represents 20% of the other measures, so it was multiplied by 0.2. And those two are totaled together. To identify the total point value out of 60, the resulting number in my model, 2.88, would then be held up against a conversion chart. This conversion chart can be found on the district's personnel webpage. Once you have your total average weighted average, the conversion chart will be looked at to identify your total point value. 2.88 would be rounded off to 2.9. resulting in a point value of 57.8 or 58 points out of 60. In addition to this video, the APPR committee has crafted a question and answer document regarding the use of the Nysut Rubric in support of this year's implementation.